So here's a term that you might not have heard before. The term Sino-African relations refers to the historical, political, economic, military, social, and cultural connections between China and the African continent. My article presentation will focus on Sino-African relations in Tanzania. Place-Based and Place-Bound Realities, a Chinese firm's embeddedness in Tanzania by Tanny Men, is a case study of how one Chinese broadcasting firm operates in Dar es Salaam, which is the former capital and largest city in Tanzania, East Africa. The case study analyzes the cultural, behavioral, and social norms of Chinese management, which may create organizational challenges and power differentials in the workplace. First, some background information. The alias Beta is used in place of the broadcasting company's real name to respect the wishes of the management to remain anonymous. Beta is a private, medium sized broadcasting firm of about 115 employees. Its headquarters are in Dar es Salaam, which used to be the capital of Tanzania. It has a high ratio of Tanzanian to Chinese employees, about 95 Tanzanian employees to every 20 Chinese employees. Next, the author notes that Chinese business practices are mainly driven by Confucian teachings, which emphasize an acceptance of hierarchy, perseverance, and thrift, but don't necessarily emphasize social obligations such as friendship and leisure time. Now that you have a little background information, the three aspects of this article that my presentation will focus on is how Chinese managers navigated the Tanzanian language, which is Swahili, the difference between Chinese and Tanzanian notions of manager and subordinate power distance, and also how differences between Chinese and Tanzanian work styles, aka long-term goal orientation versus short-term goal orientation, affected Beta employees and managers. In regards to navigating the language barrier, Tanny Men found that Chinese managers at Beta didn't try very hard. He said there is very little interest in studying or practicing Swahili, which is the national language of Tanzania. Despite having lived in Tanzania for 4 years, the design and marketing director of Beta can only say a couple of Swahili phrases. Instead, managers speak Chinese to each other and use broken English to try to communicate with their Tanzanian counterparts. Next, there was significant conflict because Chinese and Tanzanian notions of power distance between managers and subordinates are basically opposites. China is a very high power distance culture, while Tanzania is not. One quote from the text that sums up the difference nicely came from a Tanzanian worker who said, "In Tanzania, the boss is your friend. In China, the boss is the police. The CAO wants staff to be afraid. The boss is an untouchable, and one mistake could cancel all the good things that you've done." Finally, a significant aspect of manager-employee relations has to do with long-term versus short-term goal orientation, which affects the expectation a manager may have of employees and the way employees view their work and approach solving problems. According to Tanny Men, the Chinese work ethic is characterized by long term goal orientation, and the general difference between Chinese and African work ethics comes from the fact that for the Chinese, an emphasis is placed on having a sense of pride, which motivates work performance. Tanny Men cites a Tanzanian employee who was promoted to a managerial position. The employee claimed that it was due to her willingness to work harder and longer hours than other Tanzanian colleagues. Basically, a long term goal orientation in the workplace can be described by a sense of pride that motivates one's work performance, a willingness to work harder and longer hours than others, persistence, diligence, and pragmatism. On the other hand, interviews of Tanzanian employees suggest that they value logical processes in their way of thinking and maintain absolute truths. This results in a short term goal orientation. The characteristics of a short term goal orientation are having a sense of pride about work, a laid back attitude towards work, and an emphasis on leisurely time. One Chinese manager said that Tanzanians approach problems with a different type of logic than the Chinese do. This means that their way of thinking is simply different. Tanny Men cite surveys taken across different societies, which suggest that for short term oriented national cultures, cognitive consistency and absolute guidelines are necessary in order to be a successful manager. The managers from Beta are trying to meet Tanzanian employees halfway by giving more explicit instructions and logical steps. To summarize, Sino African relations is a term that describes the connections between Chinese and African people. The article, Place Based and Place Bound Realities, a Chinese firm's embeddedness in Tanzania by Tanny Men, is a case study of how the managers of a Chinese broadcasting firm supervise Tanzanian employees. Chinese business practices are heavily influenced by the teachings of Chinese philosopher Confucius, who emphasizes hierarchy, perseverance, and thrift in his teachings, but didn't necessarily emphasize social obligations such as friendship and leisure time. The case study found that managers for the Beta organization didn't invest in learning the local language, which is Swahili, and instead spoke to each other in Chinese and relied on broken English to speak to Tanzanian employees. This resulted in conflict. The case study also found that the two cultures have opposing ideas about power distance, and that the high power distance management style of Chinese managers conflicted with low power distance Tanzanian business culture. And finally, the long term goal orientation of beta managers lead them to expect employees to work longer hours than required and exercise pragmatism. On the other hand, the short term goal orientation of the Tanzanian people valued pride in one's work, a laid back attitude towards work, and leisurely time. This isn't the complete article. However, these are the three main points that I found interesting to me and that fit our discussion for the class. To tie everything together, our readings this week taught us that there's no such thing as a culture free theory of management. 40% of U.S. management appointees fail overseas, and that's because in order to successfully manage in another country, you need to take into account the cultural, environmental, perceptual, and social relational job context. I'm looking forward to our discussion, and the discussion questions will be posted below this video. Thank you.